The crystal chandeliers of the Thorne estate hummed with a low, expensive vibration that seemed to pulse through the very floorboards. It was New Year's Eve, a night where the air always felt thin and sharp, colored by the scent of heavy pine and vintage champagne. Julian Vane sat near the edge of the long, polished mahogany table, his hands folded with practiced neatness in his lap. He was a man accustomed to the periphery of power. As a corporate risk analyst, his entire professional life was built on observing the center from the outside, calculating the cost of every motion. Sterling Thorne stood at the head of the table, looking like a man carved from granite and old money. His hair was a silver mane that caught the light of the candles, and his silk suit cost more than Julian's first 3 cars combined. He looked around the room with the predatory grace of a king surveying a conquered territory. Beside him, Claire, Julian's wife, sat with a frozen smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was part of the architecture here, as ornamental and silent as the intricate crown molding that lined the high ceiling. "A toast," Sterling announced, his voice slicing through the polite chatter like a sharpened blade. The room fell silent instantly. Every guest, from the city's senior senators to its most ruthless real estate developers, leaned in toward the sound. Sterling raised his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. "To another year of Thorne Global Holdings," he said. "To growth, to undeniable power, and to the legacy we leave behind for those who actually know how to carry it." He paused, his gaze drifting down the long table until it landed squarely on Julian. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and intentionally uncomfortable. Sterling's smile broadened, but it was the grin of a man holding a hidden weapon. "And to Julian, our diligent risk analyst," Sterling added, his voice dripping with condescension, "every great ship needs a man in the hold checking for leaks. Just try not to get too much grease on your suit tonight, Julian. It's a celebratory evening, and we wouldn't want the help looking too much like help." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. It was light and dismissive, the kind of sound people make when they are relieved they aren't the target of the king's mockery. Julian felt the familiar sting of blood rushing to his face. He looked at Claire, hoping for a flicker of solidarity or a tightening of her hand, but she was busy adjusting her silk napkin. He was alone in a room full of people who viewed him as a necessary inconvenience, a clerk who had somehow managed to marry into a dynasty. Julian didn't look away from his father-in-law. He kept his eyes locked on Sterling's, recording the moment with the same precision he used for a balance sheet. In that moment, the humiliation didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a cold, hard catalyst. It was the final, defining data point in a decade-long study of Sterling's character. Julian had spent years protecting this man's empire, identifying vulnerabilities before they became disasters. He knew where the foundations were soft. He knew which pillars were hollow and which vaults were empty. The next morning, the headache from the champagne was gone, replaced by a surgical clarity. Julian arrived at his office at Thorne Global 3 hours before the rest of the staff. The building was a glass needle in the heart of the financial district, a monument to Sterling's ego. Julian sat at his desk and opened an encrypted file that didn't officially exist on the company servers. It was a private ledger he had maintained for years, labeled simply as structural integrities. For years, Julian had noticed a recurring pattern in the logistics wing of the Thorne Empire. Sterling had a habit of cutting corners in the name of aggressive quarterly expansion. There was a specific subsidiary, a shipping firm based in the port of Valerius, that handled 40% of their international trade. To the outside world, it was a miracle of modern efficiency. To Julian's trained eye, it was a disaster waiting for a single, well-placed whisper to collapse. The inconvenience was a series of minor regulatory bypasses regarding environmental safety in the shipping lanes. Individually, they were small enough to be dismissed as clerical errors or the cost of doing business. Collectively, they represented a systemic violation of international maritime law. Sterling had personally signed off on the shortcuts, confident that his political connections would act as a permanent shield. He believed he was too big to be inconvenienced by the laws that governed lesser men. Julian began to pull the first thread with the steady hand of a weaver. He didn't leak the information to the press immediately. That would be too messy and far too easily traced back to his department. Instead, he initiated a series of internal safety audits that were automatically flagged to the insurance underwriters through an automated compliance portal. He knew the algorithms the insurers used better than they did. By phrasing the reports in a specific, clinical way, he triggered a mandatory reevaluation of Thorne Global's entire risk profile. He worked with the silent precision of a watchmaker. He sent anonymous tips to the environmental oversight committees in 3 different countries, each containing just enough raw data to warrant an inquiry, but not enough to reveal the source. He wasn't breaking any laws. He was simply ensuring that the law did its job. He was the risk analyst, after all. He was just doing what he was paid for, albeit with a goal that Sterling Thorne could never have imagined. Within 2 weeks, the threads began to unravel with terrifying speed. The insurance premiums for the shipping wing spiked by 30% overnight. It was a sudden, unexplained cost that rattled the CFO and sent shockwaves through the executive suite. Julian watched from his quiet office as the senior partners scrambled to find the leak. They looked for hackers and corporate spies. They never once looked at the man who sat in the corner office, quietly filing paperwork. Confidence is a fragile thing in the world of high finance. It isn't built on solid gold. It's built on the perception of stability and the illusion of invincibility. When the first maritime inquiry was officially announced, the market didn't panic, but it did pause. The stock price dipped a fraction of a point. It was a minor tremor, but Julian knew how to turn a tremor into an earthquake. He began to leak the internal memos he had saved, memos where Sterling had mocked the regulatory bureaucrats and ordered the bypasses. The public image of Sterling Thorne began to shift in the press. He was no longer the brilliant, untouchable visionary. He was becoming a toxic liability. The elitist mistreatment that Julian had suffered was not unique, he discovered. There were hundreds of former employees and smaller partners who had been crushed under Sterling's heel. Julian reached out to them through secure channels, acting as a silent coordinator, feeding them the evidence they needed to file their own class action grievances. The pressure built until the air in the Thorne Global offices felt like it was under a vacuum. Sterling became increasingly erratic, his outbursts more frequent and more public. His appearances on financial news networks were marked by defensive rants that only fueled the fire of investor doubt. He was a man who had never been told no, and now the entire world was questioning his competence. He looked for a scapegoat, but Julian had buried his tracks under mountains of legitimate, flawlessly executed corporate procedure. The day of the emergency board meeting arrived on a gray, rainy Tuesday that turned the city to lead. The boardroom was a tomb of dark wood and heavy leather. The directors sat in silence, their faces grim and shadowed. Sterling stood at the head of the table, but he looked smaller than he had on New Year's Eve. His skin was sallow, and his hands shook slightly as he straightened his tie. He still tried to project power, but the aura of command had vanished. Julian sat at the back of the room, his laptop open and glowing. He was there to provide the technical context for the crisis. The chairman of the board, a man who had been Sterling's closest friend for 40 years, turned to Julian. "Mr. Vane, "Give us the bottom line," he said, his voice weary. "How do we fix this? What is the path to recovery?" Julian stood up slowly. He didn't look at the board. He looked directly at Sterling. He opened a presentation that he had spent his entire career preparing. It wasn't a plan for recovery. It was a comprehensive map of the empire's inevitable collapse. He spoke for over an hour, his voice calm, melodic, and terrifyingly certain. He detailed every shortcut, every insult to the law, and every hidden debt that Sterling had accumulated to hide his failures. "The risk is no longer manageable," Julian concluded, his voice echoing in the silent, chilled room. "Thorn Global is not a victim of bad luck or market shifts. It is a victim of its own leadership. The name Thorn has become synonymous with systemic failure and ethical bankruptcy. My formal recommendation is a total liquidation of assets to cover the mounting legal liabilities. There is no other way to satisfy the creditors." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Sterling looked at Julian with a mixture of pure horror and sudden, agonizing realization. He finally saw the man he had called a clerk. He saw the architect of his ruin standing right in front of him. Sterling tried to speak, to roar, to exert his legendary will, but the board members were already looking at their phones, calling their personal lawyers. The empire was over. The king had been dethroned by the man who kept the books. A month later, the Thorn estate was sold at a private auction to satisfy the first wave of creditors. The crystal chandeliers were taken down, and the long mahogany table was moved out by men in sweat-stained t-shirts. Julian stood on the sidewalk across the street, watching the movers. He had stayed with Claire until the final papers were signed, but the marriage had been a casualty of the war. She couldn't live without the name, and Julian had made sure the name meant nothing. He walked away from the empty house without a single look back. He had no empire of his own, and he didn't want one. He had something far more valuable. He had the quiet, cold satisfaction of a risk analyst who had finally balanced the scales of justice. The Thorn name was now a hollow shell, a footnote in a financial textbook about the dangers of hubris and the cost of arrogance. Julian Vane vanished into the city, just another man in a well-tailored suit, finally free. The rain began to fall in earnest, washing the dust of the Thorn legacy into the storm drains. Julian opened his umbrella and checked his watch. It was time to move on to the next chapter. There were other empires built on sand, and he had always been very good at finding the cracks. The world was full of men like Sterling Thorn, and Julian had a very specific, very lethal set of skills. He smiled, a real smile this time, and disappeared into the morning crowd. Every detail of the dismantling had been handled with surgical precision. The legal fees had swallowed the remaining liquidity of the family trust. The reputation damage had ensured that no bank would touch a Thorn project for the next 3 decades. Sterling was left with a small pension and a large amount of bitter, useless silence. He had lost his power, his family, and his pride. Julian had not just destroyed a business, he had systematically erased a legacy. As Julian walked toward the subway, he felt a deep sense of peace. The insults at the New Year's table felt like they belonged to a different life, lived by a different man. He had transformed his public humiliation into a masterpiece of corporate strategy. He was no longer the clerk in the hold. He was the man who knew exactly how much everything was worth, and he had decided that Sterling Thorn was worth absolutely nothing at all. The city moved around him, indifferent to the fall of a titan. That was the beauty of the system Julian understood so well. It was a machine that chewed up the weak and the arrogant alike. He had simply helped the machine find its target. He descended the stairs into the station. the rhythmic sound of his footsteps a quiet celebration of a job well done. The empire was gone, the name was hollow, and the risk had been entirely mitigated.